No one paid attention when she walked in, not even the court reporter. She looked like someone's grandmother. Old sweater, quiet eyes, hands folded like she'd just come from Sunday church. But the judge, he laughed. Not because she said something funny, but because she cried. She stood accused of trespassing on a porch that was once hers, the home her husband built, the place her children learned to walk. Now, they said she was just a squatter. No one asked why she was there. No one asked what she lost. Not until that door opened, and someone walked in who would change everything. You won't believe who she was, or why her quiet presence would expose a truth the court tried to bury. Let's begin the story of Martha Elkins, 75 years old, accused, dismissed, and humiliated, but never defeated. The courtroom didn't notice her at first. She entered slowly, carefully, like someone used to waiting their turn. Her steps were small, deliberate, the kind of movement that didn't ask for attention, but deserved it. Martha Elkins was 75 years old, but there was a strength in her posture that made her seem unshakable. She wore a soft beige cardigan, the edges slightly worn, and a pair of old navy slacks that hung loose against her thin frame. Her shoes, black and sensible, whispered across the floor as she made her way to the defense table. Without looking up, she didn't scan the room. She didn't glance at the people whispering or at the officer by the door. She just sat down, quiet, alone. Most people in the gallery assumed she was lost or mistaken, but no one stood to guide her. No one offered a hand or even a kind word. They didn't see a person worth helping, just another name on a crowded docket. The bailiff read out her case with all the emotion of a grocery list. Case number 47B, State of Georgia versus Martha Elkins. Charge, criminal trespass. Someone in the back row chuckled. It wasn't cruel, just careless, the kind of laugh people give when they're certain something doesn't matter. Martha blinked slowly. Her hands stayed folded on the table. She didn't object. She didn't cry. Not yet. Judge Ronald Hayes had presided over this courtroom for nearly 20 years. He believed he'd seen everything. To him, this case was the example of someone refusing to follow simple rules. Ms. Elkins, he said with a tired sigh. You again. How many times is this now? He leaned forward, the corner of his mouth twitching like he was trying not to smile. This is the third time you've been found on the property. You know it isn't yours anymore. So why keep going back? There was no anger in his tone, only dismissal. Martha didn't answer. The judge shook his head. Ma'am, you were warned. You were told that house has been sold. You were instructed to stay away. It's not your porch anymore. It's not your home. A long pause. And then it happened. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Not a sob, not a breakdown. Just one quiet drop, sliding from the corner of her eye to the edge of her jaw. The judge saw it and chuckled. Not loud, not cruel, just the kind of laugh that says, "This is ridiculous. I don't understand what you're crying about." He muttered, "You knew what would happen." Martha's shoulders didn't move. She didn't look away. She sat still as if rooted to that chair. In the press row, a young reporter named Kayla Moore blinked in surprise. She had only come to the courthouse to cover a different case, a routine eviction dispute. But something about this woman had pulled her attention away. There was a weight in Martha's silence, something deliberate, something deep. Kayla leaned in, her hand resting on her notepad, ready to write down whatever came next. The prosecutor stood up. Your Honor, the facts are clear. Ms. Elkins was found seated on the front steps of 821 Pine Street. That property has belonged to Thompson Holdings LLC for the last 5 months. Ms. Elkins has no legal claim to it. She was warned. She was cited. Now she's here. The judge glanced down at the paperwork and exhaled loudly. Fine, Ms. Elkins. Do you have anything you'd like to say in your defense? Still, no answer. The courtroom waited. A few people shifted in their seats. The clerk's pen tapped softly against her pad. Somewhere near the back, someone's phone buzzed and was quickly silenced. Then, finally, Martha moved. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small, worn flip phone. She pressed one button. No one stopped her. She brought the phone to her ear and spoke a few soft words into it. No one could hear what she said. And then she hung up. The judge frowned. This is not a time for personal calls, ma'am. She said nothing. And then, something curious happened. The side doors opened. A woman in her late 30s entered the room, wearing a sharp navy suit and walking with purpose. Her heels clicked against the courtroom floor with steady rhythm. Her face was calm, composed, but her eyes burned with something fierce. She walked straight to the defense table and placed a hand gently on Martha's shoulder. "Your Honor," she said, "I'm her attorney. I believe we need to discuss the matter of rightful ownership and history." The judge blinked. "You weren't listed as counsel," he said. "I wasn't needed until now," she replied. "But you'll want to hear this." The gallery sat straighter. Even the prosecutor paused, unsure how to proceed. Kayla's pen flew across the page. Something had shifted. This wasn't just about trespassing anymore. Martha Elkins wasn't just an old woman sitting where she didn't belong. She was someone. And this courtroom, this judge, they were about to find out why. No one could have guessed what would be revealed in the next hour. No one, except maybe Martha. Because while everyone else thought this was the end of the story, for her, it was only the beginning. Asterisk, the moment the woman in the navy suit touched Martha's shoulder, the entire courtroom shifted. Not physically, but something in the air changed. Like a storm cloud had passed through, and everyone felt the pressure, though no one could name it. The judge stared. His lips parted slightly, not in surprise but in discomfort. He knew that face, or at least he recognized something about it. But he said nothing. He leaned back in his chair slowly, like a man preparing himself for something he couldn't avoid. "My name is Natalie Elkins," the woman said clearly, "and I'm here not only as Martha's attorney, but as her daughter." The words struck like a chord in a silent room. A quiet murmur passed through the gallery. The prosecutor furrowed his brow. This wasn't disclosed. Natalie raised a hand. It didn't need to be. Until now. Martha hadn't turned to look at her. She didn't need to. Her eyes stayed forward, still locked on the judge's bench. But there was a softness in the lines of her face now, as if the presence of her daughter had given her a kind of quiet armor. Natalie adjusted a stack of papers she carried and handed them to the clerk. "These are the original deeds. The property at 821 Pine Street belonged to the Elkins family from 1961 until 2023, not to Thompson Holdings. The transfer of title is in dispute. My mother has never trespassed. She returned to what has always been hers." The judge didn't speak immediately. He looked down, flipping through the pages handed to him, his fingers twitching slightly. "Natalie continued, you may not remember this, Judge Hayes, but I do. You were fresh out of law school when you joined the city zoning committee in the late 90s. You signed off on projects that redrew entire neighborhoods. You approved zoning adjustments that quietly removed black families from generational homes. Under the name of urban development, her tone didn't rise, but her words were sharp as glass. My father James Elkins fought for that house. He built it with his own hands. When the city tried to buy it for less than its worth, he resisted. You called him stubborn. He called it principle." There was a pause. The judge closed the folder and looked up. "This court isn't here to rewrite history," he said carefully. Natalie smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "No, Your Honor, but history explains why we're here, and maybe why you're so quick to dismiss her." Silence again. Martha finally spoke. Her voice was low, like a whisper wrapped in velvet. "This house," she said, "was where I raised 3 children, where I waited by the phone while my husband worked night shifts, where I painted the walls myself when we couldn't afford help. It's where I buried my dreams quietly, so they could grow into theirs." She turned her head now, slowly, and looked directly at the judge. "You say it's not my home anymore, but when I sit on that porch, I don't see trespassing. I see memory, I see family, I see what they tried to take." Natalie nodded. "And they tried hard. Predatory lenders, property developers, and systems too tired or too disinterested to ask why someone would keep returning to an old, peeling porch." In the heat of summer, the courtroom wasn't buzzing anymore. It was still watching, listening. Kayla, the young reporter, was typing furiously. Her fingers had stopped aching from the speed. They just moved now, trying to keep up with the weight of what she was hearing. She looked at Martha with new eyes, not just a name on a docket, but the heart of something bigger. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "The title shows the property was legally purchased." "Yes," Natalie said calmly. "Purchased through a company that's under investigation for falsifying ownership chains. My mother received no notice, no chance to challenge the sale. Moved forward on paper, but never through the truth. And the truth is, you can't buy a home from someone who never agreed to sell." Judge Hayes sat very still. Then he asked, "Why didn't you file a motion earlier?" Natalie's reply was immediate, because she thought the system would listen before we had to shout. She looked at her mother now, with warmth that spoke louder than anything she'd said so far. She thought sitting on that porch would remind people who it belonged to. That quietness would be respected, but it wasn't. Martha breathed in deeply. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted to remember. A long silence stretched across the courtroom like a held breath. Even the bailiff looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure if he was part of a hearing or something more sacred. Then, from the back, a man stood. He was dressed plainly, maybe in his 60s, with strong hands and a voice that carried, even though it was soft. I remember James Elkins, he said. We poured the foundation of that house together. I was 16. He gave me my first real job. The judge looked up, startled. More murmurs. Another woman rose. My father helped paint the kitchen. I was 5. That home was part of the neighborhood's heart. One by one, others stood. A slow wave of remembrance and witness. Not planned, not coordinated. Just real people who had stayed silent too long. The court clerk looked up from her monitor, blinking. She had never seen anything like this. Natalie turned to the judge. Sometimes justice isn't about law books or case numbers. Sometimes it's about listening to the people who built what others now claim. The judge didn't respond. Not yet. His eyes were clouded with something, maybe doubt, maybe regret. Kayla stopped typing. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. She didn't want to miss a word of what came next, because deep down, everyone in that room knew this wasn't just about Martha. This was about all the people who'd ever been told their story didn't matter. This was about erasure and resistance, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was waiting for what the judge would say, waiting to see whether this courtroom, so used to routine, would finally pause and consider something far older than legal language, the truth. The silence in the courtroom stretched so long it became its own kind of sound, thick breathing, and impossible to ignore. The judge's gavel sat untouched on the bench. Papers lay still before him, but he wasn't reading. He was staring, not at Martha, not even at Natalie. His gaze hovered somewhere just above them, as if trying to locate a memory he didn't want to face. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. A storm was coming, but inside, the real one was already here. Natalie gently stepped back from the center of the courtroom. She knew she'd said enough for now, but what she also knew, and what everyone else was beginning to realize, was that this wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was becoming a reckoning. Judge Hayes shifted. He cleared his throat, then reached for a glass of water that trembled slightly in his grasp. "We'll take a short recess," he muttered, but no one moved. Not the reporters, not the spectators, not the quiet crowd that had risen to speak for Martha. Something invisible had been cracked open. Recess or not, the truth was already spilling into the room, and it wasn't going to be packed away again. Martha remained still, but her eyes softened as she glanced at her daughter. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. There was something old and strong between them, forged through decades of trying to survive in silence. Natalie turned and walked slowly to the bench where Martha sat. She placed a hand on her shoulder, not for comfort, but solidarity. In the hallway, the bailiff's radio crackled. A voice came through, low and urgent. Something about a file request. Something about a man trying to reach the judge. Back in the courtroom, the door swung open. A man in his late 40s entered, breathless but composed. He wore a dark gray overcoat, still wet with light rain. His beard was trimmed, his shoes sharp, and under one arm he carried a worn leather satchel. "I need to speak," he said, his voice echoing without a mic. The bailiff frowned. "Sir, we're in recess," but the judge looked up sharply. Recognition flickered, and then an old name returned. "Micah Freeman." The man nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, and I have information relevant to this case." Natalie stepped forward. "Micah Freeman," she repeated under her breath. "He was the clerk for the city land office in the early 2000s. My father used to mention him." Micah stepped toward the bench slowly, then paused and turned to face the room. 20 years ago, he said clearly, "I filed a series of property transfer records under pressure from the mayor's office and a private development firm. These records altered zoning maps, shifted property boundaries, and allowed land to be claimed without full owner consent." The room sucked in breath. He held up a set of files. The paper yellowed at the corners. Most of those documents were destroyed or buried under confidential clearances, but not all of them. I kept copies. Not because I thought I'd ever need them, but because I couldn't forget the names on them. He turned to Martha. Yours was one of them. Martha didn't react. Her stillness remained. But this time, it was joined by something else, like a slow breath of long-awaited confirmation. These files, Micah continued, placing them on the prosecutor's table, show that the title for 821 Pine Street was never lawfully transferred. It was flagged for review, but the review never happened. The paperwork was pushed through. During a midnight city council session, when half the committee wasn't even present, Natalie stepped forward. You're saying the house was stolen? Micah met her eyes. I'm saying it was erased in paper, but never in truth. The judge looked like a man who had just been handed a mirror, one that reflected every quiet compromise he'd made across his long career. The prosecutor was visibly rattled now. He flipped through the documents, muttering, "We'll need time to verify." "No," Natalie said firmly. "You've had time. She's had years taken from her. Time to sit on porches that used to be hers. Time to be questioned, charged, judged." Micah added, "I'm willing to testify under oath, and I have more. There are others, families who lost homes, some who never even knew why." That's when Alina, the young reporter in the front row, stood up. "Would you be willing to speak on record?" she asked. "Off camera, if necessary." Micah nodded slowly. "This needs to come out. All of it." The judge tapped his finger against the bench, not the gavel, just his index finger, over and over, like a clock ticking in his head. Then he leaned forward. "Ms. Bell," he said, addressing Martha directly for the first time in a tone that had lost its edge, "do you wish to proceed with counsel, or request a full investigation?" Martha's voice was clear and calm. "I want the truth recorded, not just for me, but for everyone who ever sat quiet while someone else rewrote their story." The judge looked down, then slowly nodded. "I will issue a motion to delay sentencing," he said, "pending independent review of these records." The gavel finally came down, but it wasn't the sound of finality. It was the sound of something beginning. Outside the courthouse, the rain had started to fall harder, but inside, people stayed seated long after the session ended. They didn't move because they'd felt it. A door had opened, a page was turning, and the story they thought they were watching, a case about one woman on one porch, had just widened into something so much larger. Natalie helped her mother stand. Martha's legs shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of history. They walked out together, side by side, with cameras following but not interrupting, because no one wanted to miss what they were witnessing. Not just a return to justice, but a return to truth. The morning after the courtroom shook with truth. A strange calm settled over the town, but beneath that quiet surface, something was beginning to stir, something that couldn't be reversed. People who had never paid attention to Martha Bell's story now couldn't stop talking about it. At bus stops, in grocery lines, and behind office doors, the name Bell was whispered with a mix of curiosity, guilt, and awakening. At the town's main library, tucked away in a far corner of the archives room, Alina Crew sat hunched over a dusty ledger, dated 1998. It smelled like time itself, faint mold, faded ink, and something older still. Her fingers traced over line after line of handwritten entries, property sales, tax liens, name changes, and then there it was, 821 Pine Street. It had been listed as reclaimed by municipal agreement, but something was off. There was no signature, no verification stamp, just a scribbled initial and a date written in haste. That alone wouldn't prove fraud, but it was another crack in the wall. Alina took a photo with her phone and tucked the ledger back, heart pounding. Every new page she uncovered brought her deeper into something buried long ago, not just by the city, but by everyone who had chosen to look away. Meanwhile, Natalie sat at her kitchen table, a stack of old letters and legal documents spread before her like a battlefield. Many were from her late father, carefully kept records of mortgage payments, home repairs, even insurance coverage. He had documented everything. Her mother had always called it over-prepared, but now it felt like he'd been building a silent shield, just in case the world ever tried to erase their place in it. Among the papers, she found a faded photograph, a mother, much younger, standing in front of 821 Pine with two little girls in braids, Natalie, and her sister, Joy. There was a yellow swing hanging from the porch, the railing freshly painted. Laughter seemed to echo off the image. They hadn't just lived there, they had grown there. Natalie's phone buzzed. It was Micah Freeman. "There's more," he said without preamble. I spoke to an old city clerk. He remembered the night those zoning changes were pushed through. Says a councilman named Elliot Norwich threatened to fire anyone who opposed the transfer. Said the land was needed for development progress. Natalie scribbled the name down. Norwich is still on the planning board, she said aloud. Yes, Micah replied, his voice tight. Which means he still holds power over what gets buried and what doesn't. But what neither of them knew yet was that someone else had been listening to Dot in a small studio apartment on the outskirts of town. A woman named Teresa Holloway sat at her desk, phone in hand. She had once worked as a junior assessor in the zoning department, barely 23 years old at the time. She remembered 821 Pine. She remembered the file going missing. And she remembered how she was warned kindly, but clearly to let it go. Now, with Martha's name in the headlines and Elena's article gaining traction online, Teresa realized she might hold a missing piece. She opened a box in her closet, one she hadn't touched in years. Inside was a single manila folder labeled Unresolved Pine Street Ver. Inside were photographs of original title deeds, photocopied memos, and one red-stamped denial notice with a handwritten note across the top. Do not process per city order. Teresa's hands trembled as she read it again. Then she picked up her phone and dialed the newsroom. I think I have something your reporter's looking for, she said. By the end of the week, the courthouse had received over a dozen requests to reopen old property disputes. What had started as one woman's case was now becoming a storm. People who had long accepted loss as part of life were beginning to wonder if they, too, had been wronged. Natalie returned to the courthouse not as a visitor, but as an advocate. She began organizing neighborhood meetings, not rallies, gatherings, safe places for people to speak, to remember, and to piece together their collective history. One night, a man named Curtis Jenkins stood up at the community center and said something that silenced the whole room. I was part of the crew that boarded up 8-1 Pine. I didn't know her name then, just had a work order. But I remember how the porch creaked when I stepped on it, and I remember it didn't feel empty. It felt like someone still lived there, like someone had just gone inside to grab something. The room was quiet for a beat. Then a woman beside him whispered, "She never left, Curtis." That was the whole point. Elena's articles were now being picked up by national outlets. Headlines: read, "The woman who wouldn't leave. The house the city tried to erase. One porch, one fight, one town's reckoning." And behind every story was a photo. Martha Bell standing on the steps of her porch, her face steady, her silence louder than any microphone. Back in his chambers, Judge Hayes stared out the window, watching rain slide down the glass. His desk was covered in files. He'd reopened cases he'd once treated as routine. But now, every name felt personal. He reached for an old letter tucked into the side drawer. It had no return address, just a single sentence typed on white paper. Justice delayed is not always justice denied, but silence always serves the wrong side. He didn't know who had sent it, but something in him knew exactly what it meant. This wasn't over. The truth had been buried, but now, one story had broken the surface, and others, so many others, were rising behind it. Asterisk. The door to truth doesn't always open with a bang. It creaks, slowly, letting in the light one fragile crack at a time. It was a rainy Tuesday when Martha Bell returned to 821 Pine Street, not with protest signs or legal documents, but with a folding chair and a cup of tea. She set them down right where her porch had once stood, now reduced to a broken slab of concrete and scattered nails. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her silence had already traveled farther than most voices ever could. One by one, people started arriving. First it was Curtis Jenkins, the same man who once boarded up her house, this time carrying a potted fern and a small apology folded in his back pocket. Then came Teresa Holloway, the former zoning clerk, holding the manila envelope that could rewrite the town's entire redevelopment history. She had kept it hidden for over a decade, not out of fear but because she'd convinced herself no one would listen. But now they were listening, and they kept coming. Elderly couples who'd lost homes to eminent domain, single mothers evicted without explanation, men who remembered working construction jobs on houses that had been built over someone else's memories. All of them brought something: old deeds, blurry photographs, receipts with faded ink. It looked like clutter, but it was history, proof. People had spent years thinking their pain was isolated, that it was just their bad luck. But now, in front of the broken steps of 821 Pine Street, they saw their stories mirrored in each other's eyes. Natalie Bell stepped onto the old porch slab and raised a stack of papers in the air. "We thought we lost everything," she said, voice steady. "But what they took from us they never truly owned. And we're not asking anymore. We're claiming what's always been ours." That afternoon, a young man live-streamed the gathering. He hadn't planned to. He'd only stopped to drop off bottled water. But when he saw what was happening, he knew it was bigger than any one person. The live stream spread, first locally, then statewide. Then, without warning, it went national. The video was titled, "The Porch They Couldn't Erase." Within 48 hours, a journalist from DC flew in. By the third day, a legal team specializing in property restitution arrived pro bono. And by the end of the week, 821 Pine Street wasn't just a ruined home, it was a living archive, a place where a community came to rewrite its story. But not everyone welcomed the change. Elliot Norridge, the city official whose signature was tied to half the questionable deeds, called it an unnecessary disturbance. He claimed the files were lost in routine digitization. When pressed, he shrugged. "Sometimes records go missing. It's unfortunate. But truth has a strange way of sticking around, Evan, when people try to bury it." Teresa Holloway's file wasn't the only copy. In a storage locker off Route 7, a former city attorney had once stashed away duplicates of every land dispute involving minority-owned properties. Why? Because his father had told him never to trust people who only smiled when cameras were on. When those files surfaced, everything began to unravel. Court dates were reopened, audits were launched. And for the first time in decades, people stopped whispering and started speaking up loudly. Judge Hayes called for a formal inquiry into all property disputes filed between 1995 and 2003. He stepped down from his usual rotation and volunteered to oversee the review personally. His decision raised eyebrows, but he didn't flinch. "Elena," he told a young reporter who'd started it all, "a judge isn't here to preserve comfort. A judge is here to preserve justice." Elena's next headline read, "Town Judge Reopens Wounds and Promises to Heal Them." Meanwhile, at the heart of it all, Martha Bell sat quietly on her chair. She never claimed victory, never raised her voice. She simply nodded when people came to thank her. She'd been standing her ground for so long, it never occurred to her that the world might finally start standing with her. One day, a group of young kids came to visit her. They weren't from her neighborhood. They came with their teacher, who had seen the live stream and turned it into a lesson plan. The kids didn't ask about courtrooms or property lines. They asked about the swing that used to hang on the porch. And Martha smiled, not sadly, but like someone remembering a place that still existed in the corners of her heart. "I used to sit on that swing," she told them, "and count clouds until I forgot what time it was." A girl with pigtails asked, "Do you think they'll let you live here again?" Martha's answer came not in words, but in a glance at Natalie, her daughter, her advocate, her voice. Natalie stood next to her, clutching the deed that had just been reinstated. "They won't let us," Natalie said softly. "We'll take it back." The fight wasn't over. The system would try again, in new ways, but now they had each other, and that changed everything. Because once a community remembers its voice, it never forgets how to use it. And once you stand for one truth, no matter how small, it has the power to shake the tallest buildings, the loudest lies, and the oldest injustices. The sky was clear that morning, the kind of blue that feels freshly painted, the kind of stillness that suggests something important is about to happen. The wind carried the faint scent of honeysuckle through the neighborhood, just like it used to when Martha Bell was a little girl sitting on that same porch swing her mother rebuilt with her own hands decades ago. But this time, the swing was brand new. So was the house. So was the purpose. They didn't rebuild 821 Pine Street to make a point, they rebuilt it to make it whole. The construction had been quiet, funded entirely by donations and managed by volunteers. The house went up piece by piece, like a patchwork quilt of old stories, new beginnings, and defiant hope. The original front steps were restored brick by brick, and the porch railing was carved by a local woodworker who engraved the words, "We remember. We return, we rise." On the day of the reopening, a small crowd gathered. No official ribbon, no fancy speeches, just neighbors, friends, and strangers who'd become family. Reporters showed up again. but this time their lenses captured something far deeper than a legal victory. They caught the moment a woman walked through a door that was once closed to her hand, held it open for everyone else. Inside, the air smelled of lemon oil and fresh pine. The walls were painted soft earth tones, and every room was filled with items donated from people across the country. Quilts from Georgia, a vintage lamp from Kansas, even a rocking chair carved in Mississippi with Martha Bell's name etched into the backrest. Every item told a story. Every corner whispered resilience. But Martha walked through slowly, fingers grazing the edges of tables and doorframes, like she was touching memory itself. Natalie followed her, holding a small box in her hands. "Do you want to open it now?" she asked. Martha looked at the box, then nodded gently. Inside was a simple frame, a black and white photograph, worn but intact, of a younger Martha standing with her parents in front of the original house. Behind them, the porch swing swayed, and her father stood with one hand resting on the railing. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stared. Then she whispered, "They would have loved this porch." Outside, someone strummed a guitar. Others sang softly an old hymn that many didn't recognize, but somehow everyone felt. Alina Cruz was there too, camera slung over her shoulder, not filming this time, just listening, observing, writing the story in her head before the ink ever hit the page. Judge Hayes stood in the back, arms folded. He didn't say much, he never did, but he'd made sure every legal document was refiled, every invalidated deed reinstated, every voice heard. He didn't need applause, just clarity. He'd spent too many years watching justice delayed and disguised, but now he was watching something rare, a restoration that began with the truth and ended with peace. In the front yard, a plaque had been placed beneath the large oak tree. It read, "In honor of all who were told to leave and all who dared to stay." A young boy knelt beside it, tracing the words with his finger. He turned to Martha, wide-eyed. "Did you really get arrested for sitting on your porch?" Martha knelt beside him. "I didn't get arrested for sitting," she said softly. "I got arrested because they forgot whose porch it was." He blinked. "But you reminded them." She smiled. "I didn't have to. I just waited long enough for them to remember." Later that afternoon, Natalie stood on the rebuilt steps with a stack of folders, this time not legal defenses, but applications for a new community initiative. They were starting a local land rights coalition, named it after her mother. The Martha Bell Foundation for Home and History. Its goal, to prevent displacement, educate families on their rights, and provide legal resources to those at risk of losing their homes. A lawyer from Detroit had already pledged her time. A teacher in Louisiana promised to turn the story into a curriculum for middle school students. And the porch, it wasn't just a porch anymore. It became a gathering place, a community hub. Every Sunday, families gathered there, 4-story circles. Children sat cross-legged, while elders shared tales of joy, loss, courage, and roots too deep to be moved. That porch became a living archive of strength. And Martha Bell, she didn't become a celebrity. She became something more enduring, a symbol of quiet resistance, of grounded truth, of what happens when one person refuses to be forgotten. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Alina finally asked the question she'd been holding on to for months. "Miss Bell, if you could say one thing to the judge who laughed at you that day, what would it be now?" Martha didn't rush her answer. She looked out over her porch, where children played, elders laughed, and music drifted across the yard. Then she said, "I'd thank him." Alina blinked. "Thank him?" "Yes," Martha said, "because without that laugh, maybe I would have stayed quiet. Maybe I would have walked away again. But that laugh, it reminded me who I was. And sometimes, we all need that reminder." She paused, then added, "But I wouldn't laugh back. That's not my kind of justice." The wind picked up. The porch swing creaked gently, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it should, settled. Not just in the earth beneath their feet, but in the hearts of those who remembered. Because justice isn't loud. It doesn't always arrive with fanfare or fury. Sometimes it comes quietly. One porch, one truth, one woman who stayed.